My name is Dr. Suzanne Stewart. I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation in the Northwest Territories. My spirit name is in Ojibwe Muskiki Ganin. In English, that means medicine hand. I'm a psychologist and a professor in applied psychology and human development at OISE, and I'm also special advisor to the Dean on Aboriginal education. I'd like to welcome and thank all of you on behalf of OISE and the University of Toronto. And I want to say that it's really wonderful to see that over 400 people have expressed interest in coming here tonight, and that over 200 people are currently also viewing this online right now. I want to remind you all gently to turn off your cell phones and to not use any flash photography, please. I saw that. The Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of U of T is pleased to present the Jackson Lecture on First Nations Education in Canada. The RWB Jackson Lecture was established as a tribute to the founding director of OISE, Robert William Brearley Jackson, who served as the Institute's director from 1965 to 75. And he served as the Institute's director. And this lecture is also made possible by the generosity of our friends and our colleagues. I would like to, before we get formally started, invite Elders Dan and Mary Lou Smoke to open us up in a good way with a traditional opening. Dan, Mary Lou?
Where I come from, when we greet one another, we say bonjour. So bonjour. Asanyenas kwayan dujnakas, makwa dodam, bachwana bay dunjaba. Ready? For those of you who don't speak Canadian, I'm going to translate what I said in the Ojibwe language. I said that my name is Shooting Star Woman. I'm Bear Clan and originally come from Batchewana Bay, Ontario, which is on beautiful Lake Superior. And I'm really honored to be here. And it would be much cooler up in Lake Superior, I tell you, because it's pretty hot here. I thought I was having a power surge, and then everybody else was hot too. So I'm glad to be sharing this with you all. I'm going to let my husband Dan introduce himself.
Bonjour. And where I come from, we say Sago. So, Sago. Sago, Skanagoga, Gitgo, Kanise. So, what I just asked you, I says, how are you all doing tonight? Are you with peace? I just like to acknowledge that this beautiful Atleo that we've been blessed with has been a good day. And we just like to open up with a invocation of the Thanksgiving words that are said before all others. So I'm just going to go into that a little bit. Yahweh, sagwaundizo, miigwetski jemenado, bindigan mishomas, senio, esquatahas kitkontanwa, guahase, jawise dodakwa, oskada nagohas, o ida hanahas. Grandfather, grandmother, hear our sacred thoughts, hear our sacred prayers as we bring our good minds and our good intentions into the circle tonight here at the Hart House Theatre, University of Toronto campus, City of Toronto, traditional territory of the Mississauga and Seneca people. We want to bring our good minds to bear for the next little while that we are going to be together, so that we know each and every one of us can encourage one another and support one another in a good way. We give greetings, we give thanks to this beautiful day that we've been blessed with, this beautiful Atleo. We give greetings, we give thanks to all the life in the water, all the life on the water, to the water, that feminine, sacred element of life that all creation needs in order to survive. We give greetings, we give thanks to our Mother Earth for the crawlers, the four-leggeds, the two-leggeds, the plants, the medicines, the rocks, the minerals, the trees, and the flyers that live in the trees. And Mother Earth, for that she is the other feminine sacred element of life that all creation needs in order to survive. We give greetings, we give thanks to our Father Sky, who represents the air. He continues to follow his sacred instructions in breathing that air, that life, into all creation. We give greetings, we give thanks to our eldest brother, the Sun, who represents fire, that fire spirit that burns inside of each and every form of life. We acknowledge the work of our eldest brother, the sun, rises in the east, sets in the west, provides us with light, and provides us with warmth, heat. So we acknowledge the work that our eldest brother does. We acknowledge our grandmother Moon, who continues to show her face every 28 days, and she recycles and purifies the water, the lifeblood of our mother, the earth. And she continues to look after all female life. We acknowledge our relatives, the stars, who remind us when it is time for us to conduct our ceremonies of Thanksgiving. And many of us are getting ready for this is the time of the thunder moon. The thunder moon is to wake up and shake up and activate life so that the next cycle of creation can begin. And it always comes with the arrival of the sweet water, the maple sap, and the thunder moon. And that has begun. So we acknowledge this special sacred time of new life energy. We also want to acknowledge at this time the four protectors, the thunder beings who are here now. We've been hearing them for the last little while as they wake up and shake up the earth. We want to acknowledge the four protectors, those four celestial beings who look after all spiritual matters. It is they who have brought us here to be with one another here at Heart House Theater. It is they who acknowledge to us that the Creator, Sagwayandizo, Gijemenedo, the Creator, the Maker of our bodies, who loves each and every one of us so much that she has brought all of us to be with one another in this theater here tonight. So in the spirit of our ancestors, we say, Miigwech, Nyahwe, Wilalin, Tapwe, Haishka Siem, Masicho, and Palamaya, and to all our relations, Daneto, Hai Hai. And we're going to pass it back over to Suzanne. Chimigwet, Suzanne. Masicho.
Thank you very much, Dan and Mary Lou Smoke. Chimigwech. Now, I know that our distinguished speakers do not really need a formal introduction, but I think it warrants a few words in order to reacquaint ourselves with some of the information about our esteemed speakers tonight. National Chief Shawn Atleo is a hereditary chief of the Hauset First Nation and was recently re-elected as National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He has worked to advance a vision of supporting and enabling the success of every First Nation on the basis of their rights and responsibilities, and take forward a bold plan of action and engagement with all sectors of Canadian society. National Chief Atleo is a tireless advocate for achieving fairness and equity in First Nations education. The Right Honourable Paul Martin served as Canada's 21st Prime Minister from 2003 to 2006, and Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002. He's responsible for two initiatives: the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative, which aims to reduce high school dropout rates of Canada's Aboriginal youth, and the Capital for Aboriginal Prosperity and Entrepreneurship Fund, which helps establish and grow successful Aboriginal businesses, both on and off reserve. Next, we have Professor and Dean of OISE, Julia O'Sullivan, who will be moderating today's event. She is a developmental psychologist and teacher who has dedicated her career to improving the outcomes for young children, especially those underserved in Canada's schools. She established the first Department of Aboriginal Education in a Canadian Faculty of Education. As the founding national director, she established and led Canada's Centre of Excellence for Children and Adolescents with Special Needs, focused on Aboriginal children. And currently she serves as Chief Advisor to the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative, led by the Right Honourable Paul Martin. So please join me in warmly welcoming National Chief Shawn Atleo, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, and OISE Dean Dr. Julia O'Sullivan on stage.
Hello, everybody. The topic of tonight's Jackson Lecture is First Nations education in Canada. And I chose this topic because I believe that First Nations education, indeed Aboriginal education, education for Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, is the most important and pressing educational priority in Canada for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. OISE, as Canada's largest and most influential faculty of education, has a special responsibility to lead in this area. We have, we are, and we will. And we are deeply encouraged in our work by the presence of hundreds of you here tonight and the hundreds around the world who are following tonight's Jackson Lecture on the webcast. So the format tonight is very straightforward. National Chief Atleo and Mr. Martin will each make opening remarks. Then I have a couple of questions to ask each of them, and then we'll go to the audience for your questions and close with final remarks from each of our speakers. And so I will begin by asking the National Chief to give his opening remarks. Where is First Nations education in Canada today?
Well, these chairs are a little deep, Mr. Boyd. Professor, first, as is appropriate, allow me in my language, Mississauga of the New Credit, express first of all my deep appreciation for being here in Mississauga of the New Credit territories. To the elders for beginning the way that we did, the way that our peoples do, and for teaching us all some Canadian language, as is my language, the Nuu-chah-nulth of the west coast of Vancouver Island. And Professor Stewart, I don't know where you went. Thank you. Miigwech, Tleko, Suzanne, Masicho, Miigwech, for not only your warm welcome, but also that which you represent, which is Indigenous academic leadership in this country, which is exciting that we now have about 30,000 Indigenous post-secondary leaders, may I say, amongst our peoples. And that begins to reflect a response to the question about where we are. In some respects, having come so far to where we would be gathered on a spring day like this in 2013, talking about what so many of us feel, the reason why we're here, one of the biggest social justice issues in this country. As the plight of First Nations, the relationship between First Nations and Canada, that runs deep. And it begins the way we've just expressed it, that it began with the making of treaty, the seeing one another, setting out that, as is described in the Tuuro Wampum, that we would travel together. As is said in Treaty 3 in Northern Ontario that at the time of the treaty making that we would teach one another. As was said by the ancestors then, that you provide the opportunity for me to share with your child who I am, where I come from, and what my people are all about. And then let's do that for one another. Instead, the path was something quite different. There was a shared sentiment that education was the most powerful tool, and I really want to acknowledge Dean, the leadership here at the university. I think the university leadership, deans of education particularly, but not restricted to, can play an important role in providing us as a country with a moment of reflection to hold a mirror up to say, where have we come from? What were those original treaty discussions all about? And what did they mean when they said that we would travel together but respect each other's sovereignty, autonomy, the languages, the richness that we've already heard a little bit of tonight. On the other hand, we have a long ways to go. We have the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population are Indigenous young people, the vast majority of which are under the age of 25, which makes me, Mr. MacDonald, an old guy already amongst the Indigenous peoples. Fastest growing segment of the Canadian population with the highest incarceration rates, higher in many respects than graduation rates in some sectors of Canada. And so you can see that we've also arrived at a moment that this evening represents that's not characterized by this day or this week or this month, but has been given expression recently with young people in northern Quebec walking 1,000 miles to raise issues and raise the consciousness and awareness. Northern Ontario, young people marching over 1,000 kilometers to raise awareness about the need for proper funding for education. And unprecedented engagement has been given expression in Idle No More rallies. The reality of hunger strikes, people saying that what's happening isn't acceptable. And so I am greatly encouraged by your presence here, by the university holding such a conversation, because the fact that we're even holding this conversation, to ask the question about where are we with First Nations education, gives me a sense of hope. Hope and inspiration that we will grasp this moment. There's a t-shirt that not everyone can see back there that says, "It's time." And that is my strong feeling, that it is our time as Indigenous peoples to take our rightful place, to make sure that every child has a fair and equitable chance in life through proper quality education. We need 60 schools right now in First Nations communities across this country. And so the gap is deep. And we have reports that are this high. So we know these issues very well. They've been studied extensively, going back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I would be well over 6 feet tall if I were to stand on top of all of these. The reports are there. We know, by and large, the what. Our challenge now is how. And I think that's part of the conversation tonight. I have some thoughts in that respect. So in summary, it feels like, in some respects, my father being one of the first to achieve an academic doctorate degree, having myself, a late grandmother, who raised 17 kids and said to me before she left, "Grandson, we fought our fights with our fists. Now it's time that we fight our fight with education." And hers was a legacy of encouragement that I think many people can relate to in your own families. And yet she also, along with all 17 kids, went through the residential school system, which under the guise of education sought not to support and empower, but to take away and to divide. And education should be a tool of liberty, not a tool of oppression. Education has the potential to develop actors for a more civil society as opposed to just human capital for a market economy. We as Indigenous peoples have a lot to offer the world. We have much to offer this country, and we're reaching out that we would return to the vision that the ancestors left all of us in the time of treaty, that we're in this together. We're all treaty people. Let's grasp this moment and say that it's this generation that's going to achieve the transformative change that we so desperately need and want for our children and for our families now. So thank you very much, Dean, for having me here this evening, but particularly thanks to all of you who joined in the auditorium and online, because you're all a part of this. So thank you.
Thanks, Shawn. So now, Mr. Martin, I turn to you. In your view, where is First Nations education in Canada today?
Well, before beginning, if I might, Dean O'Sullivan, I'd like to add my words to that, those of the Grand Chiefs. I want to congratulate you, and I want to thank you for having this first Jackson lecture under your tutelage, dealing with the issue of Aboriginal with First Nations education. I want to congratulate you on the appointment of Suzanne Stewart as your advisor, which I think is a very important symbol as well as being a very important substantial move by you. I certainly share the words and the views of the Grand Chief. To put it within, I guess, with my own context, I think that clearly we are much further ahead than we have been. I went to the University of Toronto. I spent a lot of time in Hart House. I spent time at Hart House debates. I spent time at Hart House lectures, exchanges of views. In the 10 years that I went to the undergraduate work and then went to the law school and came here, I can tell you not once did I ever attend a lecture in which they dealt with First Nations education. I don't know if this is the first time that this has been done here, but the fact that you have brought it here, I think is a great tribute to you, and I think it does show where we are. Am I overjoyed with where we are? Clearly not, and I think the best way, and God, you are right, Shawn, it's impossible to get out of this thing. I want you to understand, I'm going to do one of two things. I'm either going to fall forward or I'm going to fall back.
Falling forward only.
Yeah, well, that's the best way to go. Yeah, at my age, falling back's probably better. Where are we? I guess I would really ask myself that question. The person that I really think about is the 6-year-old who, on a reserve somewhere in Canada, is about to go into grade 1. I wonder if over the last decade, that 6-year-old has a better opportunity to graduate from grade school and graduate from high school. The numbers look a little better, but a lot of the debate at the federal level about education, and I'm going to speak to this a bit, has to do with deficits. Now, I know a little bit about deficits. The problem with a deficit is that when you say, I can defer the building of a highway, the building of a road, the building of a building, because we've got a deficit, well, you can always build that road the next year. You can always build that highway the next year. You can always build that building the next year. But if your concentration on a deficit deprives a 6-year-old going into grade 1 learning how to read by grade 3, that 6-year-old will never catch up. And they will be behind the 8 ball for most of their grade school, and quite conceivably they will drop out of high school. And I think that is the issue that we have to deal with. What I'd like to do is just to tell you some of the issues that I think we face before I come to the main issue. I'd like to talk to you, when we started the Martin Aboriginal Initiative, Education Initiative 4 or 5 years ago, we put in place a whole series of programs, all of which, by the way, are working quite well. There are 2 of them I would mention, and I won't outline them in great detail, but just to simply bring up some of the points that I think that they demonstrate. We put in place a business program, grade 11 and grade 12 business program, because we really did feel that young people who were going into high school, who were going to schools on reserve, going to schools where the majority of the students were First Nations, had a right to understand the opportunities that were out there before them in areas that they might not have learned within their own communities. And the course has been a tremendous success. We started at a reserve school in Thunder Bay, serving kids who living in communities up and down Hudson's Bay. And it has been a huge success. We picked the program up from a program that's now in some 14 countries. We merged it with the Ontario Business Program, and we set it on its way. But about 2 years after we had done the course, we took 2 of our teachers. We're now in about some 20 schools across Canada. We took 2 of our teachers, And we asked them to take a year off and to take our course so that it was no longer a business course that had been fabricated either in the United States, the United Kingdom, or in fact, Toronto. But it was a business course that brought together the traditions and the values of First Nations, of Métis, people, kids from the Métis Nation, and Inuit. And when we did that, that course took off. And I think that we'll be at 50 to 60 schools within 2 to 3 years from now. Now, why did it take off? Well, when people like Shawn Atleo or Julie O'Sullivan or Suzanne Stewart talk about the necessity to bring traditions and values, to bring to the course the traditions and values of the First Nations, they're not simply talking about bringing in traditions and values for the sake of doing it. What they're saying is that if you want to be confident in your own identity, if you want to be confident in whom you are, then we should be taught in the things that are familiar to you. When you teach business in a Canadian course, you don't teach American symbols, you talk about Canadian symbols. You don't give French or British symbols, you talk about Canadian experiments. And why shouldn't it be true for them? And this course has done that. It's the first set of Indigenous workbooks ever written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And so what's being asked for by the First Nations when they say, for heaven's sakes, our traditions are important to us? They are. They're important so that kids can learn. And it's about time that we begin to understand that kind of thing. The second thing that I would talk to you about is one that Dr. O'Sullivan is very much involved in. We all understand that people drop out in grade 10 because they really stopped learning in grade 3 and grade 4. And so one day I called the Gates Foundation. And I said to the Gates Foundation, I'd like to get somebody to go out and learn about all the research you've done in primary schools in North America. And what should we do about it? And they said, fine, we'll meet you in 2 weeks in Toronto. I thought Gates Foundation is on the West Coast, and I thought none of the Americans, they don't quite understand where the heck we are. But they said, no. They said the best turnaround program for elementary schools that has been developed in North America was developed by the Ministry of Education in Ontario about 10 years ago. And so they came, we met, and I then called the then Premier, who is Kathleen Wynne. I don't know what she's doing now. And I asked her if we could have the course. And she said yes. And she said, you can have the course, and what you really are also going to do, if you take the course, I'm going to put you in touch with one of the people who really was one of the instigators, one of the people who understood it. And that's where I first met Dean O'Sullivan. Now, this course is now under the aegis of Von Stoikoy, who is here in the front row, and Dean O'Sullivan and a woman called Carlana Lindman, who I also stole from the ministry. I'm sure I'm never going to get to come back to Ontario. But the fact of the matter is, this course is on now in 2 reserves, Kettle and Stony Point and Walpole Island in southwestern Ontario. And it's had tremendous results. It just had tremendous results in a very short period of time. Now, the lesson that I would learn from that is the fact is that while everybody is desperate to produce bad news, you can, if with a little bit of effort, you can have huge success. And it's worthwhile doing it. But the other lesson, and this is on this I will close. The other lesson is it cost a lot of money to develop this course. Education, especially when you're playing catch-up, is expensive. It just doesn't come for pennies. And the fact is that if we are going to deal with the primary and secondary school education in this country, we've got to be prepared to do a couple of things. The first is to recognize the costs and the need for catch-up. And the second thing we have to do is to understand that the single most immoral and economically dumb thing we can do is to continue to underfund Aboriginal education in this country. Now, the Grand Chief has spoken about this incredibly well and articulately across the country. And so let me simply add my voice to his and just talk about just really explain the way that I see it. Education, primary school education, secondary school education in this country is a right. It is a universal free good. Unless you send your children to private school, they're going to go to a public school where it doesn't cost them anything. Well, tell me something. If you can send your children to a school over here, and there is a school over here on a reserve 10 miles away, and the kids at this school are getting funding anywhere from 20 to 40% per capita more than the kids at this school, so that they have better teachers, so that they can deal with kids with disabilities, so that they have science labs and the kids that don't have it here. Can that be anything else but the most unspeakable kind of discrimination against the youngest and the most vulnerable members of our society? Shawn said earlier that Aboriginal Canadians, First Nations, are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. Well, they are. The government says what they want to do is to build a strong economy. So tell me, how can you possibly build a strong economy when you underfund the education of the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population? Tell me what kind of an economy you're trying to build. If what the government says is it wants to build a strong economy, and it's going to say to the youngest and the fastest growing segment of its population that they're not going to be given the education to participate in that kind of an economy, well, what kind of a country are we building? And that's the issues that we as a country have to face. So I'm sure that Julia and Shawn and myself will be talking about many aspects of education. But I think we better understand that the underfunding of education, Aboriginal education, is the elephant in the room. And it's one the government has to confront. Thank you.
What he said. That 6-year-old is now 10. His name is Jaden. And I spent time with Jaden. Jaden lives in a 12 by 13 foot, one-room home, slop pails on the front porch, no running water. That home houses 9 people. And the conversation I had with Jaden was about education. After we talked about his peanut butter on his shelf, because when I meet a person like Jaden, it's like talking to myself when I was his age. And the glint of hope in his eye, and how much he loved telling me that his grandpa is proud, this is what he said to me, is proud of how well I'm doing in school. And there's lots of Jadens out there. And they're just waiting for the adults to sort this out for him. Clean drinking water, matching a good education with potential in life, with work, the economy. That is based on a vision of Indigenous view of what that economy could look like, a view of sustainability. And Jaden's inherited the system that the Honourable Mr. Martin has just reflected on. One that, if we look back to the earliest policy statements, which in fact we can go far before the establishment of the country, to the vision of Indigenous peoples in these lands and the debates that occurred in the 1500s about whether we were even human or not, Las Casas and Sepúlveda, back in Spain in the 1500s. And we see and have inherited policy statements going back to the time of Sir John A., whereby the policy of education was one to kill the Indian and the child, to disconnect us from our elders and from the teachings, and to remove us from our lands. And that has been the exercise, which is why I'd reference that there was a time in history when our people were agreeing that education was a top priority. But what went awry is that we were sharing the what, but we didn't agree on the how. And we have an opportunity now to say, Mr. Martin, you and I, nor anyone in here created that Indian Act, but we inherited it. It makes no sense that K-12 education, for example, is still anchored with the minister, and we've had a hard time switching from Minister of Indian Affairs, its new title, Aboriginal Affairs. It makes sense that, like our First Nations leadership, it's not just myself or this generation of leaders. For decades, our people, through the gentle encouragement of people like my late grandmother, have been saying education must be a top priority. We need, as late Chief Dan George from the West Coast articulated, that the youth generation are going to have an even more difficult task than he said he had, because they're going to have to go off and achieve the education in the University of Toronto's. And this is a shout out to all of the Indigenous institutes of higher learning across this country as well. And I would encourage universities like the University of Toronto, ranked in the top 20 in the world, to continue this leadership and help reach out and support all of the Indigenous academic leadership, including those who've established institutes of higher learning that are Indigenous based and Indigenous owned. Because what I'm trying to articulate is that yes, we have a deep inequity when it comes to basic funding, and those needs are urgent and they are now. And I would encourage that together we find ways to move boldly. And we recognize that when former prime ministers step forward and give unto themselves, because I'm pretty sure you're not getting paid for tonight's gig, right?
I'm not?
No, you're not.
When business leaders, when everyday citizens, when former prime ministers step forward and say, we have a major issue that at this juncture in history we must address, well, it's for us to encourage and to thank you for that. Stepping into that space and in this moment and helping to pierce the consciousness of the country, that's what leadership is all about. It's what the university is doing here today. But make no mistake, we still have, all of us inherited a system and a structure under the Indian Act that does not work. It is deeply broken. The vision has always been, as it was called in the 70s, Indian control of Indian education. We've just updated a little bit, but it's the same thing. First Nations control of First Nations education, so that we can have our education leadership develop and design education that works for them in their respective territories. That is still something that we are working hard to achieve. It's important to note that we've had some successes in the Mi'kmaq Education Authority in the Atlantic, achieving close to 80% success rates, but doing it while making sure the Mi'kmaq language thrives and survives. We had one young woman come to our annual General Assembly just this last December and speak in her Mi'kmaq language, and she's 16 or 17 years old, and it fills my heart with pride and inspiration because of the over 50 languages, Indigenous languages, a few of which you've heard here this evening, the vast majority are on the edge of extinction, becoming only symbolic languages. And I like the way the elders have gently reminded us, these are Canadian. This is the shared heritage that was forged through the making of treaty by our collective ancestors. And we have some examples that are emerging, like the Mi'kmaq, the Nuu-chah-nulth in our territories. But not only do we not have what I feel is at minimum fair and equitable funding, we've got catch-up to do. Because if you had close to 7 generations where the education system was intended to pull families apart, what I see communities trying to do now with that lack of funding is that the elder care residence facility is where else? Right next to the kindergarten and early childhood facility. That's the vision of our leaders. Generations of attempt to pull apart and disconnect family and the generations, our leaders making every effort with minimal resources to reconnect those generations. And so we've got a structure that does not support and fund language, for example. We don't have funding for technology. We don't have funding for teacher training. Some of the basics, and we need all of them, including, as you were mentioning, curriculum. In fact, it should be, may I suggest, mandatory in every education level in this country, at minimum in the K-12 system, that, as is now evidenced in Saskatchewan, it's mandatory. Treaty education is a part of the K-12 curriculum. Well, I personally and our education leaders support the notion that by and large Canadians have not been supported with accurate, truthful information about who the Indigenous peoples are. And I think it's time as well that it becomes mandatory across the entire country in every jurisdiction.
I'd just like to pick up for 30 seconds something that Shawn said. What you've just heard is a very comprehensive and a very articulate presentation by a Grand Chief who became Grand Chief on the basis in his own mind that education was his #1 priority. Now, what he said was, we want to control our own education system. And what a lot of Canadians are going to say, wait, you want to control your own education system. What does that mean? My God, how could you possibly know how to control your own education system? There's a couple of things you've got to know. And I know Dean O'Sullivan can talk about this. I'm not an educator. I was a lawyer, so you understand the depth of my education. I have gone across this country meeting with First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit educators, PhDs, experts in every facet of education, who understand what has to be done. And you know, sometimes that they'll take a slightly different view than you might have, and they'll argue among themselves. But there is enormous skill out there in terms of what it takes to build an education system. And when Ottawa says, we have to control your education system, you must send us all of these reports. Well, understand, I spent a little bit of time in Ottawa. That Ottawa has no responsibility for education. Education is a provincial concern. There is not in the government of Ottawa a Department of Education. There are no education experts. And so what are they asking for? They're asking for people with the quality of Shawn Atleo. They're basically asking them to report to very well-meaning bureaucrats who have absolutely no education background or education skills. And this is crazy. It is paternalistic, but it is also just counterproductive. And that's why what you just heard from them, that's why the fact that Julie O'Sullivan, the dean of the most important faculty of education, one of the most important in the world, by the way, is having this session. So that's good for you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. So now, National Chief Atleo, following the Kelowna Accord in 2005, it was the intention that transformative agreements would be established in partnership with all First Nations in every province in this country. But it was only in British Columbia that a transformative change accord came into place. And it was signed by the Prime Minister of Canada at that time, Paul Martin, the Regional Chief for British Columbia at the time, Shawn Atleo, and the Premier of British Columbia in those days, Gordon Campbell. So what are the consequences, especially for education? What are they and what have they been of that accord?
Well, that accord, I think just maybe to explain further, I was BC Regional Chief for 2 3-year terms. There's 203 First Nations in British Columbia, over 30 different languages. And I was serving as Regional Chief on the National Executive under the leadership of former National Chief Phil Fontaine. Many of you will know, and if you don't, just to refresh your memory, that he was probably the first, one of the first, but certainly the first at the National Chief level to describe his personal experiences in the residential school era. And this led to important developments like the establishment of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which helped to acknowledge and recognize the deep trauma, the post-traumatic stress, and the disconnections that had occurred between and amongst communities, as well as, in an extended fashion between First Nations and Canadians. And so the iteration or the development towards and planning the work in Kelowna in 2005 also came on the heels in British Columbia. We had 3 provincial organizations recognize the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and their long-standing leadership, the First Nations Summit, who have been directly involved in land negotiations in BC, and the Office of the Regional Chief. Mr. Martin mentioned, that sometimes there's differences between us as First Nations. We're diverse. Over 50 languages. We're in every corner of the country, 633 First Nations. And very different experiences in different parts of the country, battling the War of 1812 in some parts. For those of us in the West, the Nuu-chah-nulth were an ocean-going whaling people, and it was Captain Cook who landed there. And we have diversity, and in British Columbia, there was about 20 years where there was real challenges and battles between the provincial leadership at that time, the First Nations provincial leadership. A further explanation, Mr. Martin has been talking about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. My responsibility is to advocate for First Nations. We acknowledge our Inuit and Métis Indigenous brothers and sisters. And the very nature, what this accord was referencing, is the seeking transformative change. We had, at the time, a Prime Minister, and for us in British Columbia, Premier and former Premier Campbell, who shared a vision with us that the only way forward is if we're working fully together, and that the provincial and federal jurisdictions are not leaving this work up, and that the Prime Minister and the Premier must give instructions to the entire caucus, all of Cabinet, that all of Cabinet's responsible for implementing Aboriginal title and rights with First Nations. So it's not relegated just to a Minister of Aboriginal Affairs at the provincial or the federal level. That if you're dealing with natural resource, First Nations have a right to free, prior and informed consent, and increasingly the country is recognizing both the potential of Indigenous peoples to participate in the economy, but that if you're going to have a vision for natural resource and for energy, then we have to be full partners at the table. We have to be there at the very beginning and not an afterthought. And this is what the vision was at that time. And the Transformative Change Accord led to important work that's going on still in BC. I'm proud to reflect back on. It's not my work anymore, but I'm happy to stand in support of transformation happening in health. We have provincial leadership working on the issue of fisheries. We have a provincial chiefs organization on the issue of child welfare. Work going on in the area of energy and mining and forestry and in a wide variety of other areas. And I might add, the First Nations in BC forged a tripartite arrangement on education that led to the establishment of education legislation. Once again, it's not going to be the choice that every group of First Nations in every part of the country is going to want to pursue. But it's an example where one area, where 200 First Nations and 3 provincial organizations worked together with the 2 other jurisdictions, federal and provincial, came to a tripartite agreement and said, we're going to work on this. The most recent example I just witnessed last week in Northern Ontario with Anishinaabe. They signed a memorandum of understanding with the current federal government and the current provincial government in Ontario. I understand the first of its kind, is what they're telling me. And that is the only way forward, is for the jurisdictions to truly see one another and start working on resolving these issues together. So I'm happy to say that the accord, that the Transformative Change Accord that we signed together, Mr. Martin, the leadership have been continuing that work. And it's been, it's still a work in progress, but it does require ongoing, not only political will on the part of leadership, but increasingly, if these things move to the wayside and don't stay front and center, we're only 4% of the national population. Governments have lots of things that they have to pay attention to every single day. With your help, we have to keep this front and center because of the Jadens that are out there right now. It's not just education. Education, I hope, is the door that we walk through together to transform the lives of people like Jaden. But he needs a proper house. He needs clean drinking water. They need infrastructure there. And we've got to match, if they're going to develop the natural resources of this country, $650 billion that this country is eyeing to develop in the next several decades, then what First Nations are saying is that if that's going to happen, it needs to happen with their free, prior, and informed consent on their terms. They need to be full participants, and we need to match Jaden with the potential for opportunities in the economy in the years to come. So that's the vision that's emerging, and it is not only about the education success of a Jaden remaining anchored in who he is, but Indigenous peoples want to contribute to a vision of sustainability in the interaction with natural resources and the natural world around us.
Mr. Martin, how do we keep the vision front and center? And what needs to be done now to realize it?
Well, I think that while the government walked away from the Kelowna Accord, I think that we have to recognize that the approach that was taken in Kelowna is the only one that is going to work. I mean, the fundamental issue that's existed for the last 300 years is that Ottawa simply says, this is what the world is all about, this is what you will do. There has been very little dialogue, and unfortunately not insufficient. The fact Kelowna was the first time that the federal government, the federal prime minister, met with all of the provincial premiers, territorial leaders, and the heads of the major Aboriginal associations, and then the great regional leaders, in this case, Shawn, Atleo, now the Grand Chief, was there. So think about it, the first time in history this has ever happened. It was 15 months of negotiations. But one of the major differences between this and other meetings, previous meetings, is the federal government did not go into the meeting saying, here's the agenda. We went in and said to the Aboriginal leaders, led as Shawn has said, by Phil Fontaine, what are the issues? We'll deal with your issues. And they named economic development, water, housing, accountability, as an example, education, healthcare. And then we said, and along with the Prince of Premiers, you tell us what the solutions are. We won't agree with you fully, but you tell us what the solutions are, and we will work from this. It was 15 months of negotiation, and we arrived at a complete set of agreements all the way across the board. Unfortunately, the only one that was signed was the one that Shawn, Grand Chief, has just said in British Columbia. There's something else that we did as well, and I think this goes to, again, what the Grand Chief is talking about. Ottawa, as any government department, probably any business, operates in a set of boxes. You've got you've got transport, you've got finance, and the fact of the matter is there are no crossovers. It's Ottawa, and as with any business, the way we tend to look at things is to silo everything. Well, the problem is that Indian and Northern Affairs has to deal with a wide range of things, but the health department deals with those, the transport department deals with those, and the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, which is supposed to have the responsibility to deal with these, has no authority to deal with almost any of these issues. So what we did, and I think that this is really essential, we created within the Privy Council office a secretariat. And the purpose of that secretariat, responding to the Prime Minister, was to ensure that the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs had the full authority to bring the Minister of Health in, so that in fact he could deal. Because the fact is that when the Minister of Indian Affairs sits down with the Grand Chief of the AFN, or indeed any of the Aboriginal leaders, they've got a wide range of responsibility. And the inevitable thing that happens at every single meeting is the Government of Canada says, I have no authority to act. And so what you really have to do is to be able to have a meeting of the minds. And so we set up this secretariat, and it worked very well. And in fact, one of the Grand Chief's key people is a man by the name of Jeff Copenance, who was in that secretariat, and he's sitting right here. All I can really say, in my time, he would not have worn that green shirt, Shawn. But the fact of the matter is that was an essential part of what making it work. There's a lot of common sense here, and a lot of common sense that's not being followed.
Jeff's working with me now, Mr. Martin. Stole him.
So we learned this morning that Chief Peter Muniz has declared a state of emergency in his Northern Ontario First Nation of Niskandagan. 7 people have died and another 20, and they're mostly young people, have attempted suicide in recent months. How can this happen in Canada today?
I think it's a question not just for myself and Mr. Martin, but I hope one that everyone helps to not only to answer, but to make sure that we keep asking it. Just yesterday, I received word that for the first time that 9 provinces who attended an Aboriginal Affairs Ministers Working Group in Winnipeg with my colleagues on the National Executive, and I want to reference President Michelle Odette of the Native Women's Association of Canada, helped to advance for the first time amongst all the provinces. There's a full consensus to call for the federal government to hold a full national public inquiry on the issue of over 600 murdered and missing women across this country. And it was a really important development, and Michelle and I talked late last night. And just like the crisis and the state of emergency that Chief Muniz has called, we are talking about a life and death situation. This is a dire, as Amnesty International said in their report just this last December, just a few months ago, that we are in a dire human rights crisis right now in Canada when it comes to First Nations issues. And so on the how part, on the one instance, it's how is it that we don't understand that there is a dire human rights crisis happening right now in this country, to the extent that Chief Muniz has to call a state of emergency. 7 deaths, I think 4 were by suicide. And there is already an immediate outpouring of help and support. In my language, we talk about what the chief has just done, reaching out for help. If we're all descendants of those who look to forge treaty in a relationship of mutual respect, and that treaties of peace and friendship, that amongst friends from an Indigenous perspective from my home territory, it is unfriendly not to reach out for help when help's needed. And that's what friends and neighbors do. That's what people do who care about one another. That's what Chief Munias is doing right now. Incredible sense of despair. Is it linked to everything we've been talking about? Residential schools, deep poverty, lack of education success, absolutely to that and so much more. And we need to reach out unequivocally, without hesitation, to stand with and support Chief Munias and his people. And I know that that's going to happen. I myself made efforts to speak with him, but the regional chief for Ontario and I are absolutely standing with the chief. And I know others will come. This happened in my community not that long ago, 2004, 2005, when I was regional chief. They've had, I think, 20 attempts at suicide in Chief Munias's community in recent times. It was a similar experience in Howsett. We had over 60 attempts over the period of a year, and several who completed. Suicide rate amongst our people is 5 to 6 times at least the national average. And that, amongst many other social challenges, is the reality that we face right now. It is absolutely life and death, this conversation that we're having. And I'm hopeful that through the door of conversations such as education, it's both about the education of our young people, but about learning about the broad aspect of the challenges that we face. And I'm hoping that more stories, the likes of which I'm hearing, Rotary Club in British Columbia, who do literacy work in Asia and Africa, are now at Penelakut, a little community on the east side of Vancouver Island, that when they visited, they said they thought they were in a third world country. They cannot believe that there are communities like this. Or the village community of Attawapiskat, late Shannon Kustachin, a hero to so many of us who tragically died in grade 8, traveled to Ottawa. She came and said to the minister of the day, should my community not have a school like everybody else has a school in this country? And she inspired an entire movement that in fact led to a full non-partisan motion in the House of Commons called Shannon's Dream, cutting across all political partisanship. And that's what we're imploring Canadians to help with, that this cannot remain something that divides any sector or segment of society, but that we move rapidly to respond to this very, as Amnesty International put it, and to have external validators like Amnesty International or the Parliamentary Budget Office or Sheila Fraser as Auditor General say that this isn't working. We've got to break this pattern. And then having increasingly Canadians being willing to step forward and begin digging into what has otherwise been seen as this is too complex. There's just too much to this. I don't even know where to start. And then to turn away from it. This time can be different. Conversations like this one are suggesting that, particularly with the help and aid of academic and university leadership, people have the ability to tackle tough and complex issues. There is nothing that is easy about this challenge that we're faced with right now. There is not found to be any single silver bullet that we can just grab and say, this is it here, this is going to do it now, we're okay. We don't need to do anything more. Our experience and the pattern is that there's been little spikes of attention back in the time of Oka, many will remember. That resulted in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and we had a sense of hope. There's been over 40 court cases. We had the work and the lead up to the talks in Kelowna. Last year we met with the Prime Minister in January, and then we had the Idle No More rallies. I was on the Hill with 4,000 people in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. This is the moment that we have to grasp to say we will break this pattern. It's this generation. Down the road, they will look back and they will see that you, in your moment of time, when you came to understand the challenge that was before us, stepped forward and said, no more. This is the generation that's going to bring about the change that's required. And so I encourage that when you learn about the story of Chief Munias, when you hear about the organizations like Free the Children and the Wee Days that you have, and the children come back home and tell you about hearing from somebody like Mr. Martin and his Aboriginal initiative supporting young people in school, or so many others in the philanthropic and business leadership that are now stepping forward, or aid agencies that used to do work principally in developing countries around the world, are turning their attention to Canada and saying, it's time that we dealt with our own backyard. Then Canada will be a true leader in advancing human rights. Then we can go out around the world.
I'm going to tell you a story. I hesitate to do so, and I'll explain to you at the end why I hesitate. But I just want to really add my voice to what Shawn has just, the Grand Chief has just said. I was a governor of the World Bank, and I spent a lot of time in Africa. And I was in a country in Central Africa, and where the president wanted a World Bank loan, which he was not getting, to basically help with some community development. I happened to be there. They said, would I go up and see the village, and then would I come down and meet with the president? So I got there the night before, went up with an NGO, about 5 hours by Jeep into the village, and it was simply the worst place I've ever seen in my life. It was just awful. The degradation, and the statistics had that the country had spent a lot of money in this village. It was clear they hadn't spent anything. So the next day when I came back, I met with the president and his cabinet, and he said, well, I hope you're going to give us this go back to the World Bank and ask for the loan. And I just couldn't help myself. I said to the president, I said, Mr. President, I went up and saw that village. You haven't spent a penny there. And I can't believe that, I mean, I just seen the worst misery I've ever seen in my life. And you're saying that you have fixed it and you haven't done a thing. And you're asking me to go back to the World Bank and authorize a loan. Well, obviously the president and his cabinet were stunned. And at that point, a young man who was standing beside the president leaned down and whispered something in his ear. And the president of the country said, Mr. Martin, my assistant, has something to say to you. And I said, okay. And the young man said, Mr. Martin, I went to a Canadian university, graduated from Canadian University, went there for 4 years. And 1 year, the university sent me up into northern Canada, and I visited a village. I visited a First Nations community, and he identified it. And then he said, Mr. Martin, you say you've never seen such misery. I've been in this village, and I know the village you went to in my country, and this village in northern Canada is much worse. And the fact is, I knew the village, and he was right. And I didn't know what to say. But the reason, I mean, that's why the Grand Chief is so right, but the reason that I hesitated to tell you the story is, and I mean, the tragedy that's just happened is awful. But the one thing we must never lose sight of is there are phenomenally courageous people out there in those communities. I mean, there are people who are fighting odds the likes of which most of us could never even contemplate. And they are succeeding. I mean, what Canada's First Peoples, what the Inuit, what the Métis have done over the course of the last couple of decades with very little help, to be quite honest, is simply extraordinary, and it's something of which we should be very proud. You're hearing now from the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Couldn't be much more articulate. You couldn't be much more emotional and much more substantial in what he is saying. And he represents a people who are going through terrible trauma like we have just heard. But you know, more importantly, and I wish the heck the press would start reporting this, he also represents a people who are doing phenomenal things, who are showing huge courage, who are making huge steps forward, the kinds of things that none of us ever hear about. And I think that's also an important story. And I think that we owe you a lot, and I think we owe everybody out there with you, Shawn. Because what you're really doing is you're turning around what is the single biggest affront to the values that we Canadians talk about. So good luck. Well done.
We got started a bit late, but I want to be sure that we have time for the audience to pose some questions to our two speakers tonight. There's a mic on either aisle, and all I would ask is that you keep your questions brief, because that will give the opportunity to more people to interact with Mr. Martin and National Chief Atleo.
Ushakshi Klayets Mississauga New Credit Uklasish a Klayak Hazit Aksuk New Channel At. Delighted to see Kin on the stage here, and I introduce myself, Jeanette Kwayakshi Kavanaugh from the Ahousaht First Nation, living here in Toronto. And I do a lot of post-secondary work, including curriculum development on Indigenous studies. And I think what stuns me most is how many of our post-secondary educators or even professionals coming back to get upgrading do not know a lot about our colonial history. So I think there's a huge link there about giving our leadership, our academic leadership in mainstream society a wake-up call around getting more educated around issues of Aboriginal concerns, so that we're not just dealing with token curriculum in isolated grades, but like you've all been talking about, education throughout the education system. But I think my question really tonight revolves around how do we really put our government to task, because we're the voters technically, right? We're the voters, we're the ones that the government's interests that are being represented. And we hear more and more that funding is being put for immigrant workers, skilled workers to come here and fill these jobs so that we can continue to take natural resources. And so part of the conversation I'm hearing you folks talk very, very succinctly up there tonight is the importance of building the capacity and getting our young people to catch up so we can actually participate in the economy. So what are some of the sort of strategies we can take, not just as Indigenous people, but clearly this past winter has shown that our interests intersect as Canadians, that we have a vested interest in seeing everybody rise up and leave no one behind. And clearly we have a track record, and as Shawn pointed out, a mountain of reports that are bought and paid for by taxpayer dollars to move ideas forward. So how can we imagine organizing ourselves as Canadians to hold our country to task, to take care of each other before we start farming in more people to take the jobs that we could be skilling ourselves up for? So curious what you folks have to say.
Well, she talked about government. That's you. I mean federal government. Not that we don't have our own governments. I'll tackle it from that perspective.
Well, I'll give you a very quick answer. The question that you really asked is, you asked it on behalf of all Canadians, and I think that what you've got to do clearly is to galvanize Canadians. You've got to be out there, you've got to talk to them. I find that in talking at universities, as an example, that there is tremendous support. There's tremendous support from young people. And very interestingly enough, by the way, there's a lot of support from Canadian immigrants. Canadian immigrants who have come here, who understand what it's like. You know, if you're going to move down from Northern Ontario down to Toronto, that's one heck of a dislocation. Understand what dislocation is like. But let me then ask you the question just even more, a little bit more specific. You say, what can you do? I'll tell you what you can do. You can vote. There are 40 ridings in this country where Aboriginal Canadians could make the difference. So for heaven's sakes, and the voting record of Aboriginal Canadians is very, very low. Just the threat of you voting in those 40 ridings would give you a great deal of push. So the real answer to your question is, don't just rely on other Canadians to exercise the democratic prerogative. You get out there, you vote, you work for whatever political party. I make a suggestion, but whatever political party you want, just whatever, and you will make an enormous difference, and you'll see.
That's my relative that spoke from Ahousaht. And maybe my response will pick up on, but maybe differ a little bit. And it goes a little bit like this. We have a government right now. And there'll be an election in a couple of years, at which time Canadians will choose who will either continue or be the new Prime Minister, if there's a change. And this is part of the pattern challenge that I'm trying to reflect back. That somehow these issues down the road will get dealt with. That just next year or 2 years from now is when justice will be served for Indigenous peoples. And where we're challenged is this question of voting. The ancestors who forged treaties did so, not because treaties make nations, but nations make treaties. And we still have an outstanding relationship challenge that is very much formal, structural, and legal, and constitutional to address. And what I'm suggesting strongly is that not only do we need to challenge governments in the way that perhaps mainstream and Western democracies operate, but also look at this from another human rights perspective. We're only 4% of the national population. And what we need is leaders to step forward and demonstrate and exercise political will to bring about change in this country now. That's what I'm calling for as well. We need all Canadians to step forward and say on issues like education, does it make sense that there is inequities in funding for our young people? And can we change that now? And can we call on governments to do that now? So we have a bigger conversation that has to take place, and it's a long and outstanding one. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, the earliest expression of real mutual recognition that occurred between nations. And so the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reminds Canada that it is a successor state. As such, it has inherited the obligation to work with First Nations to implement treaties in the spirit and intent with which they are understood. What does that mean, you ask? It means, and it says directly in the Declaration, that issues like education, First Nations must have a full and meaningful say with how to design, develop, and bring about education change for their peoples, using their language, using their culture. So we've got the legal instruments, in addition to all of the reports. Now it's a matter of the expressions of political will. And it is a tremendous challenge, because Canada's a vast country, over 30 million people, but remember, Indigenous people make only 4% of the national population. And so even those arguments about participation in mainstream electoral processes are extremely challenging, and part of the reason why we are still having this discussion today. Now, I think there's some even better convergence here around my relative's question. Change is already starting to occur. There are certain big natural resource and energy projects that were proposed to go ahead that maybe won't go ahead, because Indigenous peoples are standing up, they're stepping forward, and they're speaking out and saying, you need to obtain my free, prior, and informed consent before that goes ahead. So it's an economic question as well. And we can do this differently, and we can do this better. And that is by sitting down nation to nation, treaty by treaty, and reconciling with one another between our jurisdictions. So it is a matter of both the constitutionally recognized rights that are forged in the 80s being implemented. It is my view that we have yet to do that work. It's outstanding work. And when we talk about education, we're talking both about addressing the deep inequities and doing the catch-up, but doing it because the ancestors had the foresight, our ancestors, to forge in treaty that education is a right for our young people too. And we need to get on with that work. And so I really appreciate the way that you've encouraged us in this question, challenging a former Prime Minister, challenging us all to think about this in relation to the way electoral democracy works and interacting with governments. And I'm imploring Canadians to recognize this deep challenge. We're 4% of the population. We're reaching out up high stuff, unfriendly not to reach out and ask for your help to help transform the lives of our children now.
And over here, the man on the floor.
The lady was there before. Let's be fair.
The new government of Kenya, since you reference Africa, that new government has just announced that they are going to buy heavily into the one laptop per child program, also called the $100 laptop.
Would you mind starting again and trying to speak a bit louder, because it's difficult to hear you up here? Thank you.
The new government of Kenya
Kenya.
just announced that they are going to buy heavily into the $100 laptop program, also called the one laptop per child program. You know it, it's on the MIT website. I wondered if you're thinking, if you have considered doing that. It would be useful in that teachers could write lesson plans for it, particularly suitable to First Nations communities. People like myself who don't want to perhaps put money into some bottomless pit of charitable funding would happily go online and pay for a $100 laptop, probably now $150. Small children could largely educate themselves. It bypasses government, it's the people's program. Have you thought about it?
Mr. Martin.
Yes, and there are projects. Belinda Stronach has one on laptops, and there are projects out there that would allow you to contribute to these kinds of things. And I think that, yes, I think there would be enormous merit, and we found in some of our own programs where the kids have got the laptops in some of the northern reserves, they didn't have them, and they actually had had the internet. So yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to that kind of thing.
Yes, just really quickly, I want to recognize One Laptop Per Child, as well as groups like Habitat for Humanity, build homes around the world, Haiti, etc. Now building homes for First Nations and doing group builds. UNICEF work around the world, now working here in Canada. Homes on homes. We need over 80,000 units. We got to make it right, as Mr. Holmes says. So he's even joining us in that effort.
Listen, I wish somebody had given me a laptop when I was young. Then maybe I'd be able to turn on my TV set today.
Well, I spent half of my life in economic and business development, the other half in education, and they were concurrent. You may remember, Mr. Martin, that about 15 years ago, you committed to match all the funds I can raise for a fund of economic development in First Nations when you were finance minister, and it was at the Military Institute at a function. And then you had the audacity to become prime minister, and your successor reneged on it. And that was a key element of my fundraising effort with an Aboriginal partner. The point I'm trying to make is that economic development and education can be connected, those points, if you use the word entrepreneurial education. And I think that is one of the most important elements in the progress of pulling out that hopelessness of your little friend, that he can see the light of the end of the tunnel. Entrepreneurial business development is an opportunity for even kids far up north at Arawapiskat, and I think that it is a very, very key element of the educational process, perhaps on a micro basis, because you all talk about the big picture. My passion is for entrepreneurial education. 25 years ago in this country, I was called the father of entrepreneurial education. Today, I am the grandfather of entrepreneurial education. But there is one other element, and I'm really addressing National Chief on that issue. The leadership has to be educated too. There is a lot of resentment of well-meaning non-Aboriginal people who want to help. I've been at it for 15 years working with Aboriginal people, and several chiefs know me personally, and we have a very good relationship. When we sold our house, and about 3 years ago, I wrote to 12 chiefs in this province. 10 of them knew me, offering my small business entrepreneurial library as a gift. I offered to pay shipping costs, and I was prepared to give lectures, seminars, set up the library. How many responses did I get? National Chief, 0. They don't see the importance of entrepreneurial education. They don't see the importance of the small business as a key to the development, albeit not only in the First Nations or the Aboriginal community. Our government in Ottawa doesn't see small business as the key to the national well-being.
Do you have a question for the National Chief? Because
yes, what can people who are well-meaning, have a lot to offer, and don't seem to be able to reach the leadership of the national scene.
I don't think that you stop compelling governments at all levels, including the federal government. We'll continue to compel, encourage, both directly and indirectly. We have great institutions. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is an important national institution that's been established amongst many entrepreneurial circles. I'm an entrepreneur myself. Probably doesn't look like it. I was a budding chef, breakdance instructor at one time. I owned a small cafe. I thought coffee was going to be big, and Starbucks was my first competitor. So clearly, I didn't plan very well there. But I want to make the point that governments do change, and policies do change. But you and I, all of us, have inherited some deep and good historic reasons for mistrust. And having conversations where we maybe don't see one another, I still see being the pattern today. And yet we have in Chief Munias, in the deepest crisis moment, a reach out for help. And perhaps a path to entrepreneurship and entrepreneur education is what Mr. Martin reflected in the development, the genesis of the Kelowna talks, where he said, I asked the Aboriginal leadership what they wanted. And I think that kind of an approach is what I'm seeing emerging now amongst those who've got experience working around the world, including entrepreneurship, micro enterprises. Those are the kinds of enterprises that are working in my village. Some of the best bread, right, is in a house it, the best bread that you'll find. And we see that these are really important income generating opportunities that can occur in communities, notwithstanding the larger small business, as well as First Nations are not opposed to development, just not approving or accepted of development at any costs. And I do think that we've got a deficit of both understanding, the fruit of which is deep mistrust. And so when you see Chief Munias reaching out, like I said, in our culture, it's unfriendly not to reach out and ask for help. And that's what I see happening, and that's what I'm doing here tonight as well. Reaching out and asking for people's energy, their commitment, their willingness to learn and understand, to walk side by side, and to ask the question, what is it that you want to see happen in your communities and in your territories? I'm sharing a little bit of it, but I want to make it very clear. I'm not the Prime Minister of First Nations. This is not something for me to determine on behalf of Indigenous peoples. It is up to them themselves. My role is simply to help encourage and advocate, and help open doors, and though I'm only 5'4", kick them down when necessary, so that the Indigenous leaders can step into their rightful place on a nation-to-nation basis and drive that vision forward. There's probably, if I could just choose anecdotally, a number of 3 or 4% First Nations across the country that are economically self-sufficient. And many of them have incredible business and entrepreneurial leaders that are with them, that are helping to lead the way. And I do think that that's an important element here. So entrepreneurial leadership and the work that you're doing, Mr. Martin, is contributing, in my opinion, greatly. And we need to grow that out. And there are some structural challenges with the way the federal government is responding. And we need to see them respond in a fulsome way and come to the table with First Nations to break the pattern that we've been experiencing, and that you've alluded to just one policy element of it, and that's funding for small business. We need to see sustainable, fair, and predictable funding for economic development, for education, for child welfare, for clean drinking water across the full spectrum. We don't have that right now. We've been under a 2% cap since 1996. Provincial and territorial governments get 4 to 6% transfers on education and health on an annual basis. We don't have that. So they're inextricably linked. And education and entrepreneurship are two elements of a broad spectrum of issues that really come back to relationships and forging trust and understanding.
Mr. Martin.
2 quick points. First, just to pick up on where the Grand Chief left off, this is, in terms of your question, the link between education and jobs. As you know, the government has brought in a new policy saying that if you're on a reserve, you're young and on a reserve and receiving welfare, that they're going to bring in a new program of workfare so that you must take training, you must take job training. What they're finding, of course, is that if you want to take job training to develop a trade, you have to have grade 12. And those kids don't have grade 12. And they don't have grade 12 because they're underfunding education. So how in heaven's name can you have a program that says you must have workfare to get a job, but you have to have grade 12, and we won't properly fund high schools anywhere near the reserve so that in fact you can get it? It's counterproductive, and it goes back to the basic point that we've been talking about, which is the one that you raised, which is the fundamental relationship between decent primary and secondary school education as a way of getting ahead. Second point, as it pretty should be obvious up here that I am a big fan of the Grand Chiefs, and we've known each other a long time. But you learned something. Breakdance instructor?
We've time for just one last question, and then I'm going to ask for closing comments. You've waited a long time over there.
Thank you very much. I think Canada has slipped on the international stage by pulling out of Kyoto. And now it has also is leading the charge against the desertification treaty. Canada has lost its leadership position on environmental issues globally. Actually, it is getting the worst awards that environmental movement can give. And yes, enterprise education is important, but what I hear from most of the idle no more types is they are more concerned about the environment. And what is the chief has to say about the environmental issues that Canada faces and its communities face?
Thank you. Just to be clear, did you say that you were feeling that they were not expressing concern for the environment?
They were.
They were.
I didn't hear enterprise education from them at all.
Right.
They were talking of environmental more issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm saying that the chief has not today at least addressed those important issues. And as I mentioned, Canada as a whole has missed out on environmental education by getting out of Kyoto and then the desertification treaty.
When I talk about a vision for the future and that Indigenous peoples will express it, it is fundamentally about the natural world, is what I said earlier. And so we can describe that as conservation, being part of the environmental movement, supporting efforts such as the development of Kyoto, etc. In our respective languages amongst us as Indigenous peoples, in my language, we talk about our interrelatedness that we as humans have with all living forms, and that everything that we see is living and must be respected. And so with a philosophical foundation like that, it's the reason why when I use phrases like, we will give expression to what sustainability looks like. That means that if development's proposed like it is all throughout the country, if First Nations see that as a threat to their environment, we're seeing them step forward. And Idle No More was not only in response to several pieces of legislation, C-45 and C-38. Make no mistake, those two unilateral pieces of legislation are only the latest in a 100-year legacy that includes the Indian Act. Unilaterally, externally imposed, developed and imposed on our people. And so while those acts for First Nations threaten not only Aboriginal title and rights and treaty rights, the empowerment that Idle No More and that our young people particularly are saying is that not only do we want to challenge governments in the unilateral development of legislation, particularly where it conflicts with our vision of sustainability with the world around us, taking care of the natural resources. It goes against the right to free, prior, and informed consent over what's happening in our territory. Well, let me put it this way. We have our own Indigenous laws. And if our laws, with the support and instruction of the elders, under the leadership of our chiefs, or the manner in which communities are governed, if we feel that it's necessary to step forward and protect our territories, notwithstanding what other jurisdictions, including federal governments, will suggest, we will stand up for our lands. We will stand up for our waters. We will stand up for our territories. And those are not just words, that is action that our people are taking. And it's inspiring to me. It's being led by young people. They're the leaders, not of tomorrow, as they're so often told. They're the change leadership we've been waiting for, and they're here now. I will be on the West Coast tomorrow, standing with Tsleil-Waututh, as they stand up for their territories against resource and pipeline development in their area. So there is a great convergence, I think, in this country. We have a government that Canadians, by and large, put in place, irrespective of what arguments may be for or against the current first-past-the-post electoral systems. I think there's a big argument and a big debate to be had about real forms of expressions of democracy that Indigenous peoples have had for millennia. And that's a conversation for another day. But for now, I believe that our stance and our people's stance to care for the environment has been ingrained in all of us. And I see that with my own kids as they help care for the territory where I come from on the West Coast. So I think this is a great opportunity for convergence of not only Indigenous peoples, because we are interacting around the world in Indonesia and Scandinavia, etc., but it's also a chance for Canadians and First Nations. As John Ralston Saul eloquently said, to pick up on Mr. Martin's earlier point, in his talks after he wrote and published A Fair Country, Truths About Canada, he says there's a missing conversation in this country, First Nations and the immigrant population, particularly new immigrants who are coming here and learning about this country, who have experience of moving from one jurisdiction and context and coming into another. So it is a conversation with all Canadians, whether people have been here, for 10, 12 generations or have just newly arrived in this country. It's a missing conversation that we need to have. And so I hope that helps, from my perspective anyway, to express the sense of inspiration that I have, especially on our young people that are learning about these issues, and they're standing up and they're stepping forward, and their voices will be heard.
And the last question goes to you.
You?
It comes from you.
Maureen Anglin. I'm from Frontier College, and we're a national literacy organization, and we run out-of-school programs like homework clubs and reading circles, and in particular Aboriginal literacy summer camps across the country. And I would like to know what you see as the evolving role of out-of-school programs within First Nations education.
Of out-of-school programs?
So it's programs that happen after school, before school, during summer, that sort of thing, and what their role is in supporting First Nations people.
Well, I can pick up if you want, just to begin. Obviously, Frontier does an incredible job. And I don't think I'll be very quick. The night is long. The summer camps that you run are huge. One of the things that and Vaughn can speak to this, or any one of our people, that what happens so often is that you come the course in during the school year, and then summer vacation comes, and you start again in September, and you find that you simply lost half the benefit that you had gained before. I think the summer camps are a tremendously valuable idea, and I think the work that you're doing, which I know a lot about, I think is very, very valuable. I also think the same thing applies in an awful lot of the after school, the extracurricular activities. Essentially, we all did it. I don't quite understand why we think that young First Nations kids at a school wouldn't want to be looking for extracurricular activities. We all did. So I think that all of these things are very much part of the school system. But they cost money. And the fact is that the money isn't there for half these extracurricular activities. Just think about give you one example. The school that we're in Thunder Bay is a school bringing all these kids down from Hudson's Bay. So what do? The kids leave at the age of 14 from a 300-person village on the shores of Hudson's Bay to come to Thunder Bay to go to high school, and they live in a boarding house. And there is absolutely nothing for them to do outside of that. Now, they're finally going to build, after 50 years, build a residence, and hopefully they'll have extracurricular activities. So, no, the point that you've raised is incontrovertible.
And so we're drawing to a close, and I want to ask you to deliver some final remarks. National Chief Atleo, First Nations education. Where do we go from here?
I don't get to defer to my elder.
You can if you'd like.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Why do I think in other occasions when he refers to the elders, he means that as respect? Well, I'll be very quick. I think that where do we have to go from here? I think it is a responsibility of government. I think it's a responsibility of all of us in terms of our dealing with the First Nations to create an ethical space for better dialogue. If you take a look at the history of what the First Nations have gone through, it has been the unilateral imposition of the federal government's view time and time again. That's been, you can clap. I don't, it's been so long. That is, in my opinion, the absolute key. You have just heard, for the last period of time that we have been here, you have just heard from the Grand Chief. Think about this. He is not coming in and saying things that any of us in this room, I suspect, would disagree with. What the positions that he has put are well argued, they are reasonable, and they're the kinds of things that will move it forward. In heaven's name, why would any government then say, well, we're not going to talk to you, we are going to tell you what it's going to be, and you will live with the consequences? That's what's happening. It's happened for 250 years of Canadian history. If you want to know why we're in a mess, that's what it is. So if you ask me, where do we go from here? It is to simply say no more unilateral action by any government.
What he said. I will just close very briefly, reflecting back and appreciating how the elders started our evening, and reminding us that at this cycle in the year, as the weather gets warmer, time for rebirth and regrowth. And I'm hoping that reflects the moment that we're in our relationship with this country. I'm hoping that the awakening that is occurring is one where we as Indigenous peoples have the confidence to take our rightful place in the world, to encourage a different way to view topics like education. And I believe that we are having that impact and will continue to have that impact. We have lots to offer, discussions around economic development and the relationship with the natural environment, to talk about what a sustainable future looks like, and not to punt these issues to future generations and allow the grandkids. And Mr. Martin, it is absolutely with respect that I consider you an elder as a grandpa. There's only very few who've been Prime Minister in this country, and I've had the opportunity to work with 2 Prime Ministers now, and I know that Ottawa is a challenging place, everybody. This is a democracy based on a political system that is our current reality, and if we're not careful, we'll slip into patterns that we've had in the past, and we'll be repeating ourselves. And we'll punt this down to a future government, a future generation, and it doesn't need to be that way. I ask that we seize what the elder has said. When the ceremony was done, our collective ancestors did ceremony too at the time of treaty. They prayed together, and they had a vision of the future that we're now charged with implementing. We've been walking separate paths. And as my father will remind me, son, you can take the hard way or you can take the harder way. But Dad, there's got to be an easy way. No, son, you're looking for the easy way out. So let us not choose what we think is the easy way, the silver bullet, the single thing that will do it, or to leave it to somebody else. Let us choose the hard path, and that is we need to dig in. We need to seize this moment, and we need everybody on board. This is, because I'm a West Coast kid, all hands on deck. right now, at this juncture in history, the prayers have been said, the elders have guided us in this, the ancestors have been called as well. We have their wisdom, strength, and encouragement along with us. And so it is, Mr. Martin, as respected elder and leader in this country, that you've taken it upon yourself to step forward and say, I recognize that we've inherited this, and I'm going to do my part. And for that, I thank you for your leadership as well.
Seconds, Suzanne is going to accompany the elders on stage to do our closing. Before she does, on behalf of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, and the University of Toronto, I want to thank you both. You have honoured us with a truly remarkable and memorable evening. Please join me in thanking the Chief and the Prime Minister. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Shawn. I've seen you at Chippewa this summer.
Yes, this summer.
Yeah. Do you remember? It's been an amazing night, and I'm so honored to be here, to be in the presence of these wise people on the stage, and to have so many people come out to listen. I really appreciate the support that you all have for all of us, for us Native people. One thing I keep telling people is you got to remember that we're all treaty people. You know, it wasn't just we said we give up the land. We said, okay, we're going to share the land. This is the deal. Now, the non-Native people have the land, but we're not getting our share of the deal. So we really want to thank everybody, and we're going to do a closing, and we're going to see the Native American stairs. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the wind, and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me, I come before you, one of your children. I am small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty, and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made, my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise that I may know the things you tell my people, the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength not to be superior to my brothers and sisters, but to be able to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me ever ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so that when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. I'm a
Thank all of you.